fellow readers and readeresses. August has come to an end and I can't believe summer is almost over. I feel like January was just like yesterday. But it is what it is, and what it is time to look back at all the books that I've been able to read during this last summer month. I read 12 books for a total of 4,179 pages. We have 4 fantasy, 2 classics, 1 science fiction, 1 chick lit, 1 manga, 1 graphic novel, 1 thriller, and 1 historical fiction. And in terms of categories, we have 7 adult books, 4 young adult, and 1 middle grade. I physically own and read 7 of the books, 4 I read as ebooks on my Kindle, and 1 book I split read between Kindle and listening as an audiobook. So let's go through all the books one by one in the order in which I read them. First, we have Vesper Team by Margaret Rogerson. This is a young adult fantasy novel, and at the time I read it, I thought it was a standalone, but it turns out it was actually book number 1 in the Vespertine series. And thank God for that. The story is set in a fictional medieval world where the spirits of the dead are coming back to torture the living. We follow young Artemisia, who's training to become a Grey Sister in a convent. Grey Sister in this world care for the bodies of the dead in order to ensure that their spirits will pass on. Artemisia here has had a troubled past, and because of her personality, she's having a bit of a trouble connecting to the other people. I absolutely love this book. I read it within the first week of August, and as soon as I was done with it, I already wanted to pick book 2, which is kind of rare these days. I seem to enjoy taking a break between the books of a series. But not in this case, and it's kind of unfortunate because as of this moment there is absolutely no information on book 2. Well, let's go back to the book. The world is so interesting, the atmosphere was gloomy and dark, but at the same time it was quite cozy. I love the characters of this book. Our main protagonist was such a delight to read about, and the supporting characters actually felt like real people with real agency, which I have noticed is somewhat rare these days, especially when it comes to young adult fiction. I can't wait to see more of this world. I gave this one 5 stars and I highly recommend it. The Drowned Woods by Emily Lloyd-Jones. This is a young adult standalone fantasy novel, and I got it in my July Illumicrate box. It's set in the kingdoms of Wales, which according to the synopsis are rife with magic and conflict. We follow 18-year-old Margaret, who is a water diviner and who has recently escaped from the prince who a long time ago took her away from her family and has bound her to his service. By the way, if you are curious about this book, I advise you to not read beyond the first paragraph of the synopsis that is provided online, and that includes Goodreads, because it straight up spoils the biggest twist of this book. I read this one as part of my experiment to see whether Illumicrate books were any good, and you can watch the video over here if you want. In that video, I have a full review, so I will summarize it somewhat crudely here. I didn't like it. The characters were bland and the plot didn't make any sense at times. I could call it an okay book up until about 60%, and then I was like, okay, this is just a waste of time. And maybe it was, but I pushed through and finished it anyway. I gave this one 2 stars. The Andromeda Strain by Chrichton. This is an adult science fiction novel and is one of the better known books by the brilliant Chrichton. It is also the first book in the Andromeda duology. It is set in Arizona mostly and follows a group of characters, all of whom are called to deal with a crisis caused by an alien virus. I liked this book just fine. The setup was interesting and the predicament our characters were dealing with even more so. The characters were also interesting to follow, though I don't think we got to know them particularly well, and as always, I very much enjoyed Chrichton's style of writing sci-fi where the ethical and scientific intertwine repeatedly. I find the questions that he raises fascinating and often find myself thinking about them long after I have finished reading his books. However, this time I had a bit of an issue focusing, and it may or may not be the book's fault, but I would just drift off and then all of a sudden realize that I don't remember a single word of the last 3 paragraphs of the book, and then I'd have to go back and reread them. So naturally my enjoyment of this book was somewhat diminished. I gave it 3.5 stars. The Shadow of What Was Lost by James Islington. This is an adult epic fantasy novel and is the first book in the Lycaeus trilogy. This has got to be one of the books that has been on my TBR for the longest time. I remember wanting to read it back when I first started watching BookTube and people were hauling it, and that was many years ago. This book is set in a world where the society is split between people who wield magic, the gifted, and the people who don't. 20 years ago, they all went through a civil war because the then ruling magic wielders called augurs started abusing society and the people revolted. And as a result, now all the gifted are bound by a mark on their skin to obey the non-magic people. We follow a group of young people who have been involved in a dangerous mixture of political scheming and old legends awakening. This book was a lot. There was so much in it that I had trouble keeping up with it all at times. There were too many plots, too many mysteries, and too many reveals. Now, that's not to say that I haven't read other stories who had just as many, but rarely have they been stuffed in the same book. Kudos to the author for coming up with all of this, but I think he went slightly overboard. In my Goodreads review, I made an analogy with overeating. After a certain point, no matter how delicious the food is, you just can't appreciate it anymore. You need to take a break to be hungry again. Same with this book. At some point there were so many reveals that I kinda just needed a break. Despite that, the story is interesting enough for me to continue with the second book after I have taken sufficient time away from the series, of course. I gave this one 3 stars. The Bookshop on the Corner by Jenny Colgan. While I was reading The Shadow of What Was Lost, I decided that I needed something chill and undemanding to read in parallel, and that's when a friend of mine suggested that we read The Bookshop on the Corner. This is an adult chick lit and is the first book in the Scottish Bookshop series. We follow Nina, who despite her amazing ability to pick a book for anyone, loses her job as a librarian and is looking for a new beginning. So she buys a van, converts it into a bookstore, and moves to Scotland. Sounds like fun, doesn't it? Funnily enough, we read book 2 earlier this year because I had purchased it without knowing that it's actually a part of a series. Now, as far as chick lit goes, this one is pretty good in my ignorant opinion. There is an amazing environment here, an interesting and inspiring premise, and even a few quite complex storylines. But unfortunately, I utterly disliked and just couldn't understand the behavior of the main character, especially at a few specific points. And the romance was just weird. It went in such a strange direction for quite a while, and even now I can't figure out why it was needed. Ultimately, I would have liked this book way more had there been no romance at all. Regardless, I think it would appeal to most women who like books, and I do recommend it. I gave it 3 stars. Fullmetal Alchemist Volume 3 by Hiromu Arakawa. This is Volume 3 of the Fullmetal Alchemist manga series, which follows 2 young brothers who try to bring their mother back from the dead using alchemy, and as a result, one of them loses 2 limbs and the other his entire body, so now they go around looking for ways to get their bodies back. As you may know, if you've watched my video on the books that I want to finish before the end of the year, you might know that I have as a goal to read all the way through Volume 5 before 2023. So I am steadily chipping at it. I just love this series, and I love this volume as well, and I gave it 5 stars. Avatar: The Last Airbender, The Promise, by writers Jean Luen Young, Michael Dante DiMartino, and Bryan Konietzko, and illustrator Gurihiru. This is a young adult graphic novel and the first book in the Avatar: The Last Airbender comics series. It follows the characters of the Avatar TV show after the events of the main story. Now, I'm not gonna give you a synopsis for this one in case you haven't watched the animated TV show of Avatar, because I think you should. It's lovely. This was lovely too, and it was great to be back in this world. The art style was so good, just the style that I like, and it really brought the characters to life on page. The story was also interesting, though slightly disjointed and random at times. I gave this one 4 stars, and will soon pick the next one in the series, which I believe is The Search. Call of the Wild and White Fang by Jack London. To be back in your childhood and look at it with grown-up eyes. Such a bittersweet experience. This is a bind-up of the 2 stories, each of which is a classic historical fiction. Each follows a different dog/wolf and represents life through their eyes. And even so, they're both so gritty and realistic somehow. They're brutal in some ways, but also heartwarming in others. Honestly, after reading The Call of the Wild, I felt such a terrible longing for living life as though I'm not doing so currently. It's just such a weird feeling, but I quite like it, I gotta be honest. I can't pick a favorite story between those 2 really. Each of them made me so happy to read it. And both made me so cozy and transferred me straight into the frozen wilderness, which is hilarious because I read them in the hottest month of the year. Nevertheless, I gave them each 5 stars. The Death of Mrs Westway by Ruth Ware. This is an adult standalone thriller and follows young Harriet, who reads tarot cards for a living and is in quite the financial trouble. Just then, she gets a letter stating that she might be entitled to some hefty inheritance. But Harriet knows that this could not be possible and that the person they're looking for is definitely somebody else. Yet, she needs the money, and this might be her only opportunity to get out of the mess that she's gotten herself into. I have a full spoiler-free review as well as a spoilery talk on the book, so I'm not gonna spare any time talking about it, and if you're interested, you can go watch those 2. I gave this one 3 stars. The Blacktongue Thief by Christopher Buehlman. This is an adult fantasy horror and is the first book in the Blacktongue series. It follows young Kinch Nashanak, who is a thief trained by and indebted to the Takers Guild. I don't want to tell you anything more about this book because I went into it blind and loved it, and I think you would too. The book is gritty and hilarious and is full of mystery and magic. It has a great world building and some very interesting characters. I won't say anything more because I'm planning on making a full video about it, so stay tuned. I gave this one 4.5 stars. Heidi by Johanna Spyri. This is a middle grade classic about an orphaned little girl who is sent to live with her grumpy grandfather in the mountains. I just love this story. I read it for the first time as part of my school reading back when I was a kid, and now 20 years later I'm reading it again, and my feelings haven't changed one bit. It is so cozy, and there is so much simple joy in it, despite the hard lives that the characters are living. I gave it 5 stars. The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This is an adult historical fiction and follows the story of a fictional famous Hollywood actress who recounts her life story to a journalist for a biography. I read this one partially as an ebook on my Kindle and partially listened to it as an audiobook on my way to the gym, and I highly recommend the audiobook. It's narrated by a few very talented women whose names I will put on the screen for you because I don't remember them. Now, to say that I was skeptical picking this one up would be a great understatement. We're talking about a historical fiction about a made-up Hollywood star and her love life. I couldn't care less. And then during the first 15 to 20% of the book, it got even worse because the main character Evelyn was terrible, using and lying to people for her own agenda and then dropping them as old socks as soon as she didn't need them anymore. The book was full of shallow people hungry for stardom and set in the worst place I can think of. So I was not having a good time and considered DNFing it, and boy am I happy that I didn't. This story, the things the main character went through, the sacrifices that she made, and more than all of that, the honesty with which she made them, and the magnificent way she took responsibility for them, it made it all worth it. She faced so much unfairness and so many challenges, but she didn't curl into a corner and play the victim. She did what needed doing and never gave up. Additionally, the book addressed some very hard topics, and in my opinion, it did it with the respect and nuance they deserved. By the time it came to its ending, I was ready to sob like an idiot. But you can't prove I did it. I loved it and gave it 5 stars. And those are all the books I read in August. Overall, a very good reading month. Now let's chat. Have you read any of these books? What did you think about them? Also, what did you read in August? I'd be delighted to steal some reading ideas from you, so let me know in the comments down below. Thank you for watching. Have a lovely day, and I wish you all an endless summer. Once upon a time, there was a person who wasn't subscribed to my channel. And then they did. And they lived happily ever after. This could be you.